I often get asked, what is traditional conflict resolution? So if you're wondering what traditional conflict resolution is or how it might differ from more contemporary approaches to conflict resolution, stay tuned. I'll share with you how those aspects of traditional approaches are being used today to innovate contemporary approaches to conflict resolution. So let me just start by saying it's a little hard to really pin down what we mean by traditional forms of conflict resolution, but here are some characteristics that are often associated to more traditional approaches. First, when we speak of traditional approaches, we often mean those that are outside of or apart from Western approaches to conflict resolution. So the kinds of formal systems of courts and law and adjudication that you might find in the Western European or US model, where people go before judges and are represented by lawyers. A second characteristic of what we would call a more traditional approach is conflict resolution approaches that are more informal. So often they might emphasize the local values of a community or an organization. They sometimes are more collectivist in nature with less of a focus on individual rights. So this focus on individual rights is considered really much more contemporary. If you look at traditional forms of conflict resolution, it's often incorporating the values of the community or the family. You'll often find that those approaches are more informal. So for example, it might be a community council. It might be a round table. There might be wise elders who are brought in to either issue a result or inform a resolution in some way. They might have more aspects of mediation. The other real feature of more traditional approaches to conflict resolution is that there'll be much more of an involvement of the community generally. And instead of having a single person decide, or maybe a jury decide, there is often an effort to bring in the consensus of the parties, the consensus of the community in some ways. So another really important feature of not all, but of many forms of traditional conflict resolution is that it'll focus on reconciliation between the parties or perhaps restoration of relationships and reintegration back into the community. So one of the reasons why these features tend to be more in traditional approaches to conflict resolution really relates to a difference between contemporary society and most traditional cultures. In a traditional culture, people were much more geographically bound. So if there was a conflict or a dispute between a community or between perhaps neighboring communities, the reintegration and reconciliation were really much more important because somehow this community, this group of people, or these two communities would be touching on each other, would be working with each other, would need to find a way forward. In a culture now where people travel more, where there's a lot more ways of connecting with people outside of geographic boundedness, our conflicts sometimes might be much more one-off, and so there often is less of an interest of that reconciliation or restoration. So all of this then leads to the question of what do these traditional approaches to conflict resolution have to offer us today? Because I would say, and this is what's really interesting, is that many of the ideas that I just talked about have actually become part of the ADR movement. So when I say ADR movement, what I mean by that is the alternative dispute resolution movement in the United States and beyond. So the ADR movement, which in the Western world, right, really began in 1976, and often, right, we think, oh, we have all these new and innovative ways of resolving conflict. So truth of the matter is many of the aspects of the modern ADR movement that we say are new and innovative really have existed in traditional cultures or indigenous communities for years. So if we look at, for example, restorative circles. So in a restorative circle, which we kind of say is this new approach to justice and conflict resolution. But the reality is it's drawing on many of the practices and values that are part of traditional conflict resolution. Things like emphasizing the role of the community, or emphasizing healing, or taking individual responsibility for harm and then collective responsibility for reintegration. Or if we look at something like mediation, right? We think mediation in Western culture is something that is new and innovative, but in fact, those ideas of allowing for more informal justice, for allowing for individual party autonomy, for what we say focusing on underlying interest, not just rights and positions. These are really taken from processes in traditional cultures and traditional conflict resolution. So lastly, right, the role of apology and forgiveness, which often we think is this kind of newfangled idea, especially if like you're in a law school and you're thinking about the role of apology and forgiveness. It seems like, oh, that's so outside the legal system. And introducing that feels like new and, kind of controversial. But the reality is that apology and forgiveness have been parts of all sorts of traditional dispute resolution processes. And you find this in, for example, Japanese culture. Literally, there's this idea of what's called an apology cake. So, for example, if a car perhaps hits a bike and the bicyclist is injured, the driver of the car not only will often apologize, but within the next day, the injured person might suddenly get an apology cake delivered to their home. Or if you look at in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was set up after the end of apartheid. This was seen, and in many ways, right, was a historic way to deal with a deep wound within a society. At the same time, right, it drew on traditional aspects of conflict resolution that brought in the historical wisdom of the community, that valued societal healing and justice and accountability and reconciliation. So one of the great opportunities that those of us who do conflict resolution have right now is to not just focus our study on traditional Western approaches to justice and conflict resolution, the kinds of things we'd see in a TV show about, police and courts and criminal justice, but to draw upon this historic wisdom that cuts across so many cultures and across human wisdom to really innovate and to really do something that goes to the heart of what anyone who's really committed to conflict management and conflict resolution does, which is fitting the dispute resolution process to the context and to the nature of the injury and the nature of the issues and the parties involved. So, if you want to keep learning more about mediation and conflict resolution, watch this next video, which is what are the steps in the mediation process? And of course, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and ring the bell. I'm Bob Bordone, and thanks for continuing to negotiate together. Okay, you know you want to keep watching. Click that button.